Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, Brian got George Martin's attention with the Beatles. Martin liked their personalities and the sound. He liked their personalities and the sound they had, which wasn't like any other pop group in Britain at that time. Then the other guys in EMI liked what they heard too. So Brian went with Dick James as their publisher, and they were ready to roll. So let's see what happens next. Brian wanted to get the Beatles on television. He called Associated Rediffusion, an independent television station in London, and asked to speak to Miss Vivian Moynihan, manager of the Light Entertainment. He told her he had a group that he wanted her to see, and she said to Brian, "Tell me where the group will be playing," and she would send someone over to check them out. Brian said that wouldn't be a good idea. Then Vivian said that they didn't book anybody blind, and Brian said that he didn't want to do that. He said, "These people are really rather special, and they are soon going to be making a second record, and I think it will be quite sensational. They've been working at the Cavern in Liverpool, and before that they were working in Germany." He asked her for an appointment, a meeting set for 11 a.m. 2 days later. When they met, she was disarmed by Brian. She learned of his background in the theater, and she had that background too. She said he was charming, self-composed, determined, and well brought up, and nervous about his own ability. She thought he was driven with the Beatles because he was sure. And she also thought he was a young gentleman with a mission. Vivian hoped that they were as good as he thought they were, and he told her he was now going to, and Brian told her he was now giving them a salary. Vivian asked if he had a contract with the Beatles, and Brian said, "Well, we shook hands. Their relationship was built on complete trust." Vivian thought to herself, "Very strange. I hope they don't rough you up too much, Brian, because you're rather nice." Subject to an okay from the production time, Vivian agreed that they could talk of an appearance for the group on an important weekly magazine program, Tuesday Rendezvous. December 4th, 1962, the Beatles made their way to London to do a live performance. Vivian noticed that the interaction between the group and Epstein in the studio was noticeably different from that of other acts and their managers. When Brian spoke, they listened. They didn't necessarily agree, but they didn't disagree publicly. She thought it was because of his style. They never, ever really understood him, but they liked him and respected him. Brian soon discovered that being a manager wasn't just business. He had to have diplomacy as well. George Martin told Brian that when it came to the actual recording, that he wouldn't use Pete Best as the drummer. Martin said he can't keep time. He's not a good drummer, and we need one to bind this group together. "I'll book you a session drummer. It shouldn't affect you. You can do what you like with the group." So Martin was implying that Bess, who was handsome and attracted female fans, seemed an integral part of the group and could remain for live performances. Martin said he didn't realize that the Beatles were thinking of getting rid of Pete anyway, and what I said was a catalyst to firing him. George Martin said, "In my mind, it wasn't an important decision. He was not an important member of the band. He was good-looking, but he didn't say anything." At the test session, Bess was sullen. He had the good looks of James Dean, but he was in a corner all alone. He didn't have the charisma of the other three who were laughing and joking. He didn't contribute anything lively to the group. When Brian told the group about George Martin's decision, it confirmed their instincts. Their hot favorite as their new drummer was Johnny Hutchinson of the hugely popular Big Three. He was the first choice, said Cilla Black. The drummer must have thought the Beatles were going to be big and didn't want to be part of them because he had the Big Three. More likely, though, John, Paul, and George thought his personality was too strong. The Beatles told Brian that they thought Ringo Starr would be better for the chemistry of the group. He was currently with the band Roy Storm and the Hurricanes. The next day, Lennon told Epstein that he would personally recruit Ringo if Brian would fire Best. On the morning of August 16, 1962, after a sleepless night of worry, Epstein faced Best in his Whitechapel office. It wasn't unusual for Brian to meet with Pete because Pete had been the group's link man in administrative matters. Best felt that something was going on when he first started talking with Brian Epstein. He exchanged pleasantries with Pete, which was unusual because Brian usually got straight to the point. Finally, Brian said, "The boys want you out and Ringo in. The boys and George Martin don't think you're a good enough drummer." He was brutally frank for not wanting to plunge the knife in, and Bess was embarrassed. There wasn't much more to say. Ringo was already signed, but there was 3 more shows before he could join the Beatles. Brian had the quaint idea of business as usual, even with a tense situation. There was little thought of Beth's feelings being in the band for 2 years. Brian was stunned by Beth's non-appearance that night at the River Park Ballroom, Chester. In Epstein's world, a diary engagement was always to be kept. He failed to realize how shattered Beth had been by the method he considered sly. Beth was deeply hurt that the Beatles, particularly Lennon, had not shown the guts to confront him personally and explain the firing. And he never understood, even a quarter of a century later, why he had been sacked after 2 years of musical success and personal harmony. Pete never appeared with the Beatles again. Epstein, who didn't want animosity, tried to heal the wound by offering him the drum chair in the Mersey Beats, a rising local group that he was considering for management. Pete Best refused and joined the Lee Curtis All-Stars, managed by Brian's friend Joe Flannery. The rumors started about Best and his exit throughout the Liverpool pop circuit. Bob Wooler and Ted Knips and Brian had dinner together. Bob, a journalist as well as an MC, all of a sudden said he was going to tell the true Pete Best story. There was a silence, and Brian said, "You can't do that. You just can't." And Wooler said, "I'm going to do it," and Brian got red-faced over it. They argued for a few minutes, and Brian got up and paid for dinner with the 2 other men and himself, and he said, "I'm sorry, I must say goodnight, gentlemen." Knibbs got on Wooler for overstepping the mark. He said what happened between Best and Epstein and the Beatles was none of his concern. Wooler said that the truth must be told, but Knibbs convinced Wooler by phone to call Brian and pacify him by saying he wasn't going to write the article. Epstein wasn't a man to hold grudges. He realized he needed Wooler's friendship. The night was gone, but not forgotten. Johnny Hutchinson, curiously enough, filled in as a drummer while they waited for Ringo. The Beatles didn't like his attitude. Brian was afraid of Hutchinson's aggressive ways. The Beatles, especially Paul, didn't want a drummer who was too clever. They wanted a drummer who would happily take a subordinate role, and this would allow Lennon and McCartney to dominate. Ringo Starr was a capable drummer, driving the group well and pleasing George Martin. Ringo was passive and non-threatening to John and Paul, and his sense of humor fit in with the groups. Epstein admired the Beatles' choice, but he was worried about the fans' reactions of their decisions to get rid of Pete Best. After a cavern session, Brian asked Bob Wooler and Paul and George Harrison to join him for a drink. The pubs closed at 10 p.m., but Brian knew a place to go. It was the Old Dive. Brian was friendly with the landlord, and they were let in a side door when Brian knocked on the window 3 times. In the pub's back room, Paul and George did most of the talking about Best leaving the group. Brian was listening and watching. Wooler said he was bitter about it, and he said to them, "I see no reason why he should go." And Brian asked Wooler how the fans would react. And Wooler said they would be amazed. The meeting was supposed to soften up Wooler because he was a key link between the Beatles and the fans. Wooler left Brian, George, and Paul feeling that Wooler was disappointed. Epstein didn't dare go near the cavern for a week until the club manager, Ray McFall, gave him a bodyguard. Even then, he was physically knocked about in scuffles with the Beatle fans, who now believed that Brian was wrecking their band. Brian told John to tell Ringo he should shave his beard and tidy his hair to become a Beatle. Pete Best fans bearing placards proclaiming "Pete is best" and "Pete forever, Ringo never" marched outside Nims. Brian was bruised physically and inwardly over Pete Best. He was remorseful, full of guilt about Pete's brutal exit. Brian extended a hand of friendship by sending him a birthday telegram for his 21st birthday 3 months after he was fired. November 24th, 1962. Congratulations, many happy returns. All the best, John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Brian. And I bet that went over like a lead balloon. So I'll end the video here. In this episode, Brian gets the Beatles on TV, and then George Martin said to Brian that he wasn't going to let Pete Best play drums on the recording session. He felt that Pete couldn't keep time. George Martin said that Brian could keep Pete for live shows or do whatever he wanted. It was at this time, though, the Beatles were looking for a good reason to get rid of Pete, and George Martin gave them that excuse. It caused Pete Best hurt feelings, especially towards John Lennon, because he could have taken Pete aside and told him why he was being let go. He had been with the group for 2 years. Then Brian saying that Ringo wasn't able to play drums for 3 nights and he was expected as a fired Pete to be there was crazy, so I don't blame him for not showing up. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated as always. And your comments are always fun to read too, so I want to thank everybody for that. I have a list of Amazon merchandise in the description part of my video, and if you click on it, it will take you to the Amazon page, and if you see anything you like and you purchase it, I get a small commission at no extra cost to you. I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.